Hi, how's it going? My name is Charlie and I have been dabbling in booktube lately. If you are subscribed to me, you probably know that I talk mostly about my personal life, recovering from an eating disorder, body acceptance. I actually don't watch any of that content on YouTube. I typically watch like commentary, drama videos, video essays, specifically ones about Avatar, and also booktube, which is book YouTube. And so today I thought I would kind of dabble in a booktube video because I've had some people ask me about my favorite books, and these aren't like my all-time favorite books. I do want to do a video about my all-time favorite books. I thought it would be fun to do my favorite books that I've ever been assigned in school. These are my favorite books that I've ever been assigned in school before. I'm sure that I've read other books in school that have been amazing and I loved them. These are just the ones that, like, if I couldn't remember them in the course of 2 days, then they weren't important enough to include on the list. So we've got 12 books, and just as a note, I was homeschooled through until 8th grade. So I had free choice of books pretty much until 8th grade, except for one book, which my mom assigned me, which is on the list. So if you had assigned readings in elementary school, I didn't. I had free choice of whatever I wanted. So I read Harry Potter many times, Series of Unfortunate Events. I read the Charley Bone? Is that what they're called? I read lots of fantasy books because that's what I loved. As I got older, I've kind of expanded. Obviously, a lot of these books are written by white men in like the late 1800s, early 1900s. We're just gonna go with it. I also have 2 books on the list that I don't have physical copies of. But yeah, let's get started. So the first book that I want to talk about is Island of the Blue Dolphins. This book my mom assigned for me to read when I was homeschooled. I think I was around 4th or 5th grade, which is the standard time that people read Island of the Blue Dolphins. It's one of the required reads for California, I believe, for 4th grade. I loved this book so much and I threw a huge fit about reading it because I was a really picky kid. I had a lot of like strange anxieties and stuff, and one of them was like old books. I was like afraid I was gonna get like sick from the dust. I don't know.
Yeah, Charlie. That's called OCD. You've been diagnosed. You know what it is.
My mom finally convinced me to read this and I've kept my copy ever since because I loved it. I haven't read it in about like 5 years or so, but oh my gosh, I remember loving it. I'm sure that reading it now, I'm going to have a very different perception of it, seeing as it's about an Indigenous woman all by herself, and the book is written by a man. I actually do not know the man's race. It is written by Scott Odell.
So I did just a very brief research about Scott Odell. So he was born in Los Angeles, California in 1898, and he lived nearly 100 years, and he wrote a lot of novels. He wrote 26 children's novels, and a lot of them were taking place in historical California and historical Mexico, which is near where he was raised, obviously, from being from Los Angeles. I can assume that he is like Irish or Northern European ancestry based on his last name of Odell. So he did not have any Indigenous ancestry, which is important when you're writing stories about Indigenous people. So if you have any recommendations of Indigenous stories by Indigenous authors, please let me know in the comments because I'd love to read them from that particular perspective.
So Island of the Blue Dolphins is about Karana, who is an Indigenous girl who is living all by herself. She's lived alone on the Island of Blue Dolphins is what the island is called, and she's lived there totally alone for years. She does have a dog, if I'm remembering correctly. It's a survival story, and I remember hearing survival stories. I remember reading books like Hatchet and stuff, and they were all about boys, which is great because I still was able to relate really easily to male characters, but having like a girl character survive on her own was like everything to me. I loved Karana so much. I made a doll after her. This book was just wonderful. I want to read more about like the cultural elements of this book, its relation to Indigenous culture, and also the author's relationship to that, because the author's name is Scott Odell, which sounds like a very Irish name, so I'm not sure if Scott is Indigenous or not, but it'd be interesting to look into. This was my favorite book that I read in elementary school, aside from one other one, which I don't have the physical copy of, but I loved By the Great Horn Spoon. This is another like adventure book. I really loved adventure stories. This one is about a boy and his like butler-ish from his family, and they're traveling all the way down around South America to come to California for the gold rush to bring his family back gold. I also had a big crush on the butler because he gets in a fight in one scene and I thought it was so cool. I read this in one of my homeschool groups. We had a historical literature group and we read books that happened in history so we could read fiction, but we could also talk about the historical elements, and this is one of the ones we read and I just remember loving it. I can't find my copy anywhere, but I know I have one. I think it might be packed in some boxes somewhere. But yeah, by the Great Horn Spoon. It was one of my favorites when I was a kid. Probably doesn't hold up now, so I don't know if I'll reread it, but it has good memories in my head. So now we're skipping to 8th grade because now this is when I finally get some assigned readings. I have 2 books that I want to talk about for 8th grade. The first one is The Outsiders, which I'm sure many of you have had to read before. The Outsiders is a coming-of-age story, which I love. It is about some young teenagers. I believe they're like 14 to 16. It is written by Essie Hinton, who is a woman, and she started writing this book when she was 16 years old, which totally blew my mind as a kid. I was in 8th grade, so I was like 14, and I was an aspiring novelist myself, and so I was so excited to hear that the author not only was a woman, but writing at a young age. It was published in 1967. It takes place in the 1950s, I believe, and the main character is Ponyboy, and it is about Ponyboy's gang, essentially, that he is in, and his gang of greasers is what it is called. They're being goofy kids getting into trouble, and then I'm sure most people have read this book, but there's a very big moment that happens between Ponyboy, his friend Johnny, and then the rival gang, which leads into this super intense adventure. There is a lot of violence, which was a lot of violence for me to read in 8th grade. This was pre-reading Hunger Games, and so it was like the most violent book that I had ever read. I loved Ponyboy so much. I loved everything about The Outsiders. When I read it, I loved getting to really dive into it in a classroom setting because this was the first time that I had ever had the opportunity to really dive into a book in an English class before, and I was obsessed. So The Outsiders was a really great way to introduce me to a classroom version of a book group, and I loved The Outsiders so much. The next book on my list is actually a play. It's the first play that I read in school. I did have a play group when I was younger. We read a few Shakespeare plays, and we also had read some Oscar Wilde, typical homeschool kid things. But this is the first play that I read in public school, which I had actually read portions of during homeschooling, which is Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which was a mandatory read for 8th graders when I was in 8th grade. Midsummer Night's Dream is everything. It is my hands down favorite Shakespeare play of all time, and I have read many. I just love A Midsummer Night's Dream. There is fairies, there is magic, there is romance and adventure, there is songs and music, and even just reading it, you get the magical feel, even if you aren't watching a production of it, which I love. It is a comedy, which of course we know means that they end up together. Comedies, everyone ends up wed. In tragedies, everybody ends up dead. And we know that everyone ends up happily ever after, which already makes me feel good about reading it. I also have an annotated version, which is really helpful, especially as an 8th grader, to decipher some of the Shakespeare language. I don't know what it is. It must be that I read some Shakespeare when I was homeschooled, but I feel like gifted. Why did that come from my nose? I feel gifted in being able to decipher a lot of Shakespeare because I read it so young, and it's just so fun. I love Puck so much. Oh my god. Puck really helped to like launch my love for Puck in the Sisters Grimm series, which I read before I read this in 8th grade. I read the Sisters Grimm when I was like in 6th grade. Obsessed. Highly recommend for any young person or for someone who likes young person literature. You know, Midsummer Night's Dream is great, and it is a really great basis for a lot of literary references that you'll get later on too. Amazing. Now we are moving on to junior year. I could not find any books freshman year or sophomore year that were super notable to me. The only one that I can think of for freshman year would be Romeo and Juliet, which I loved, but there weren't any other books that really stood out to me freshman year or sophomore year, and I think that's partially because with my mental health freshman and sophomore year, I wasn't that engaged in school, and so a lot of my focus was to other things, and I didn't keep up with a lot of my reading. But by junior year, I was ready to go, and I have a lot of books for junior year. So let's go. First, we have Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. I am a big John Steinbeck fan. I think it partially is because I live very close to where a lot of his books take place. He writes a lot of books in Central Valley, California, and I live in North Bay, California, which I pass through Central Valley every time I go visit my boyfriend in San Luis Obispo, and so I get very reminiscent of my Steinbeck reads. But Of Mice and Men is hands down my favorite Steinbeck that I've read. Of Mice and Men is about George and Lenny, who are two friends looking for work in California, and they end up on this farm. Lenny is a big guy who, it's implied and coded that he deals with a developmental disability, but it's never outwardly stated. It says that he often acts childish, but it doesn't ever say what type of developmental disability he has. Seeing as this is taking place in the 1930s, I believe, it makes sense that it doesn't explicitly say, especially because a lot of diagnoses were not common at the time. There's some really heartbreaking moments. Like, one of the saddest books that I've ever had to read is Of Mice and Men. It talks a lot about George and Lenny's friendship and also the downfall and like Lenny not knowing his strength because he is such a big guy and doesn't understand how much power he has. It is just an emotional read, and just thinking about it makes me sad. My junior class went to go see a play production of this at our local theater. I have never cried so hard at a live performance ever in my entire life. Like, I cried so hard at the finale of this. It was not fair. Not fair. One of my favorite books of all time. I highly recommend. I'm sure most people have read this before, but still one of the greatest books I've ever read. Next, I actually only have one more for junior year, which is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This book blew my mind. I think that because I'm talking about so many like classics and Shakespeare plays and things, people are gonna be like, of course it blew your mind. It's a classic for a reason. But I like, oh, what's this? Aw, I have a note from a friend in here. I loved high school. I hated high school, but I loved it. I was so happy that I found this book at a thrift store right before it was assigned to us at school. I also have notes. This is when I got into my annotating. Very cute. If you don't know the plot of The Great Gatsby, I am so excited. You're in for a treat. So The Great Gatsby is narrated by our he's kind of our protagonist, but he's also just kind of the narrator. His name is Nick Carraway. Cousin, I believe it's his cousin or his friend. I can't actually remember. Is named Daisy, and Daisy and her husband are, what is her husband's name? Holy crap. What is his name? How did I forget? I hate him, so it's understandable. There's Jordan Baker, Daisy Buchanan, Tom. I hate Tom. So Nick goes to visit Tom and Daisy Buchanan, and they live near New York City, I believe. And while he's there, across the lake, pond, it's much more like a lake, across the water is this huge mansion that is owned by a man named Jay Gatsby, and he is very mysterious. And it just so happens that Nick is renting a little cottage house near Jay Gatsby's mansion, and he gets to know him. They become friends. You hear a lot about Jay Gatsby's past life. He throws these huge extravagant parties. It's the 1920s. That's a very key point I forgot to mention. It's the 1920s. There's a very loud crow outside. This was one of... Can you not? I'm gonna close my window. Felt like it was one of the first, aside from like Of Mice and Men, that was like the first more adult book that I really like fell in love with. It was, I always have a hard time with books that are written for adults, and I mean the classics are a great way to get into that because you already have a lot of background knowledge about classics. I knew that it was in the 1920s. I knew a little bit about Daisy and Jay Gatsby already, so when you have a little previous knowledge, it's easier to get into it. But I just like, I loved it. Oh my god, I drew a map in the back. That's so cute. Oh my god, I love that. Good job, Char. So good. Will always be on my list of favorites. So now we're going on to senior year of high school, and I have a few books for senior year. We read a lot, I feel like, senior year, but there were only two that really stood out to me. So let's do it. This is the first one that I actually expected to hate. Also, I would like to preface that this is a war novel. I am not a fan of war novels. I think that they definitely glamorize war in general, whether it is a positive or negative like depiction of going off to war and fighting. I just am not a fan of just, you know, glamorizing their propaganda essentially, and I'm just not for it. However, this book was assigned to me and I loved it. I can't tell you that I didn't. It is a war novel, so take it for what you will, but I loved it. It is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. As you can see, I loved it very much. I think there's a lot of notes in here too. It's kind of notey, not crazy notey. Here's the deal. The Things You Carry is about the Vietnam War, and each chapter is a different person's story and it switches perspectives, which is one of my favorite ways to tell a story. It's one of my favorite narratives when you get multiple people's perspectives, and then at the end everything comes together. This was also a book that was like violent beyond belief for me, especially as a senior in high school who had been exposed to very little like novel violence, and so I was shocked. I was so like captivated by it. People's versions of storytelling, these aren't true stories, but they're based on true stories. What my teacher told me, it could be totally wrong. We did a lot of writing about this book, which might also be why it's so like strong to me and I remember it so much. But I will say, out of like the 10 books we read that year, this and one other one made the cut and all of the other books got donated. So definitely not for everybody. It's definitely a war novel, so take it for what you will. At the time, I didn't have a lot of thoughts about war novels, but now I have thought about them a little bit more and just not as comfy with them as I was before. Then we also read a play senior year. We did one play every year, and this is the one we read senior year. I just talked about in a vlog recently. I have 2 copies of it. I read Hamlet, which is second to Midsummer Night's Dream. And they might be tied, to be honest. I think Midsummer Night is my favorite comedy and Hamlet is my favorite tragedy. I have 2 copies. This is a very old copy that I just love. I love old books, but I needed a copy to annotate for school, so I bought a second copy that I annotated. It is falling apart. That's how you know you loved a book. Hamlet is such a good blueprint for so many stories that we know today. For example, The Lion King is based off of Hamlet. So many Shakespeare plays are like a basis for later books and movies and plays, but Hamlet for me was just magical. That's like the best way for me to describe books, is like magical. I don't even know how to describe Hamlet to you if you don't know the plot of Hamlet. Essentially, Prince Hamlet, his father has just mysteriously died, and his uncle Claudius has taken the throne alongside his mother. His father comes to him in the form of a ghost and tells him that his uncle Claudius murdered him. And so we have this murder plot that Hamlet is trying to prove. At the same time, he is kind of losing his sense with reality as he just saw his father as a ghost. There's also a tragic love story between Hamlet and Ophelia is controversial again, but one of my favorite female characters in the Shakespeare that I've read so far. I know that she is like a tragic character and many people don't like Ophelia, but I do really like her, and I don't know what it comes from. It might come from a place of protection. It might come from a place of like relating to her, especially as a senior in high school. Hamlet is just one of my favorite reads that I was ever assigned. It came to me at the perfect time senior year, and I loved every rendition I've seen of it. I've seen plays and movies, and it's a good time. I also actually have another copy because I have the complete works of Shakespeare. So I've got it everywhere because I love Hamlet so much. So now we're moving into college, which is actually a very fun time. I was a literature major in college for a very short time, and then I recently switched to early childhood education / humanities. I'm studying to be a preschool teacher, but I was studying literature for a while. And even though I was studying literature, I didn't read any fiction. All of my assignments were nonfiction, and if you know me, I hate nonfiction with a passion, and I'm not going to regret it, and don't regret saying it. I'm not going to take it back. Don't try to convince me otherwise. Nonfiction is boring. I actually have one nonfiction book there, but in general, I love fiction. Fiction is where it's at for me. When I'm reading, I want to escape. I just want to immerse myself in another world, and that's what books are for me. They're like a window to another world. And so when I realized that so many things I was reading in my literature courses were not fiction. I was so sad, which actually is partially the reason that I switched majors. And it turned out that many people in the literature department were huge fans of nonfiction, which was really surprising to me. And many of the books that I read in my early English courses at my community college were also nonfiction. I did like some of them, but you know, nonfiction just doesn't speak to me in the way that fiction does. So I'm just going to share some of the ones that I did love. Just for record, I have been in college for 5 years and I only have 4 books. So it takes a lot to make the cut for these. We're going to go with this one. So I took this class. It was Introduction to the Novel. It was one of my favorite professors I've ever had, and it was at my local community college. We have As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. This book is great. It hits the sweet spot for me of being in the like late 1800s. I believe it's 1890. It was published in the 1930s. I believe that it was took place in the late 1800s, which is my sweet spot. Essentially, the matriarch of the family has just died, and the family is trying to carry her dead body to where she was born because her dying wish is to be buried where she was born. Another favorite, this switches perspectives between the different characters. You also have a young kid, the youngest of the kids, I believe. We're never told his age. My class speculated he was between the ages of like 8 and 12. It's really interesting to hear his perspective. This one is also written in, which is so fun. Really liked this book. There's also a lot of Shakespeare references in it, if you are a Shakespeare fan. There's a lot of biblical references. I just love picking apart books and finding all of the little metaphors and references in it. It's so fun. I love it. Definitely different than like, her curtains were blue, so she must have been sad. Like, not that, but the references where there's like similar arcs to other stories and you can compare the different arcs, or you can say, did the author get inspiration from this? There are references to Shakespeare, To Be or Not to Be, which is Hamlet, my king. I just really liked it. It was interesting. There is a twist at the end, which I always love. As I Lay Dying, it was a big surprise. I actually thought I was gonna hate it, especially because this book looks so boring, but I really liked it. I did. Next, this is the last one that I read in community college that I have on the list. This is A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. Also, you can tell that I totally love this book. Wow, this one totally surprised me. This is another book that switches perspectives, and not only does it switch perspectives, but each chapter feels like an entirely different story until like the last 1/8 of the book, and then everything comes together. So it feels like you're reading a bunch of short stories, and then all of a sudden you're like, holy shit, it all makes sense. Also, there's a really interesting chapter that is done in PowerPoint, which is like so creative and weird, and I kind of love it. It explores like a bunch of different neurodiversities of how people tell stories, which is cool. A bunch of different perspectives of varying ages and backgrounds and places in the world. And I can't even like begin to explain the plot of it because there's so many plots all happening at the same time, and everything connects at the very end. And it's amazing. It's so good. It's like a huge puzzle, and when you finally connect it all, it's like so satisfying. The next book is the only book from my time at UC Santa Cruz that made the cut, which is another Shakespeare. It is Othello. Shakespeare is having a big day here.
Hello. Editing me here, realizing that I did not pay very good attention sophomore year in high school because I read this sophomore year of high school. I know the plot. I'd seen productions of Othello before, but even while filming this video, I forgot that I read this when I was in 10th grade. So technically I read this in 10th grade and in college, and my feelings about it changed.
I took 2 Shakespeare courses at UC Santa Cruz because I love Shakespeare. That's what you get for being raised as a homeschool kid. I loved Othello so much. Desdemona is one of also my favorite characters. Iago is also a fantastic villain, and I love that we get to see a lot more of Iago than we do Othello. So there's a lot of talk about race historically, which is very interesting, but it also is a lot about deception. When you read Shakespeare like this, it is just the dialogue with hardly any stage direction other than like enter and exit. So you don't get a lot of the setting, which I love because I can build it myself in my head. And it's great for directors of plays or films because they have total creative control. And I think that that is a lot of Shakespeare's intent with leaving things so open-ended. I could be naive on that, I don't know, but I really love this. I love Desdemona. I played her when I was like 12 in a play called I Hate Shakespeare. I played Desdemona. And the last book that I have been assigned is The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. I just talked about this in a vlog as well. I just finished this like a week ago. It was assigned for my child development class actually at Sonoma State University where I am now. It is a memoir about Jeanette Walls' life. So this is the only nonfiction book that made the cut. This book is outstanding. It is so good. I read like half of it in a day. I was just totally captivated by her life, her family, and the way that her family chose to raise the kids. When the kids grow up, they decide to move to New York right out of high school, some of them while they're still in high school, to leave their parents, and the parents follow them to New York and choose to be homeless. And it's just a very interesting family dynamic. It's heartbreaking. Huge trigger warning for sexual assault. Fair warning, it is really intense. I'm definitely keeping my copy, and I'm hoping to see the film soon. It has Brie Larson and Woody Harrelson in it, but the book is also split up into sections based on where they lived in their life. So yeah, we've got the desert, the mountains, and the city. Those are all of the books that I had. That is a lot. I've just been filming for like an hour, so fun times. This was really fun to talk about books. I don't even know if I'll edit or post this, but it was just fun to talk about them. Well, those are all of the books that I was assigned that I loved. There were other books that I was assigned that I did truly enjoy, but just didn't make the cut. Honorable mentions go to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Diary of Anne Frank, To Kill a Mockingbird. Of course, you know, those are some of the classics that you have to read in school.
I also think something important to note is that how much you like a book and appreciate it can totally depend on who taught the book and the time in your life that you read it. For example, like I mentioned, I read Othello when I was in 10th grade, and I didn't particularly like my teacher that was teaching that book at the time. On top of that, I was in not a very good place to be appreciating a book like that. I had other things on my mind that were more important at the time, and so it changed the way that I liked it. If I hadn't read it later in college, I probably wouldn't like it the same. Keep that in mind if maybe your favorite book didn't make the list, or when you're looking back at books that you read and people are surprised when you didn't like a book that was their favorite. There are a lot of factors.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope that it was interesting, and if you're interested, let me know what your favorite assigned reading was in school. I'd be so happy to hear it if you have any. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!